Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk About Climate, a podcast where we talk about climate change and how it relates to all of us. Join us, Change the Chamber fellows, as we talk with scientists, grassroots campaigners, politicians, and more to open up the conversation on climate. I'm your host, Mary Crockett, and today we're continuing the conversation on wildfires. In the last episode, we spoke with Elizabeth Blake, a research assistant at the University of Washington, who is currently working to develop a national wildfire disaster dataset. For part 2, we'll be discussing the human dimensions of wildfire disaster, and I've asked fire scientist and associate professor Dr. Paige Fischer to come on the show. I'm super excited to speak with her because her research explores how we as individuals make decisions to reduce wildfire risk and how we're learning to live with the stressors of these disasters.
We make decisions that are more about doing what's socially acceptable or doing what our neighbors are doing as opposed to what makes the most sense or, from a financial standpoint. So there's all these different biases in our decision making.
To quickly recap for everyone that missed the last episode, on January 7th, 2025, horrific wildfires broke out across the city of Los Angeles. In total, the fires burned over 38,000 acres of land, killed 29 people, and current estimates are saying economic loss is at $250 billion. Although many factors need to be accounted for in the escalation of wildfire activity, there's no doubt that climate change is accelerating both their intensity and frequency across the U.S. Climate change increases heat, which by default extends drought, and on top of that, we're seeing a lack of humidity or a lack of moisture in the organic fuels that help a wildfire to spread. The trifecta create an environment ripe for fire to start and spread, and it's often difficult for people to see the direct impact. We can only expect the fire trend to go up and solutions across the board are needed. Luckily, people like Dr. Paige Fischer are working on them. Thanks for being here today, Dr. Fischer. Tell us a little bit about your work and how you research human adaptation to wildfires.
My research is all about behavioral adaptation to climate change broadly, and then specifically wildfire risk, which is exacerbated by climate change in many contexts. It's not the only, climate change isn't the only driver for sure, but wildfires are getting, happening more frequently, and they're becoming more severe, more damaging in a lot of places. So the research I do is mostly at the individual or household level to understand how people make decisions and how they, what kinds of actions and strategies they undertake to reduce, the damages, and to learn to also just learn to live with wildfires or other kind of climate-related stressors. And so in terms of the frameworks, the theories and frameworks I'm using to explain decision-making or human behavior, I'm mainly drawing off of psychosocial frameworks and human environment geography frameworks that help us understand kind of all the different kind of cognitive biases and social influences that shape our decision making, because we're not really all that rational all the time, and we make decisions that are going to protect us maybe in the short run, but not necessarily in the long run, protect certain kinds of assets over others. We make decisions that are more about doing what's socially acceptable or doing what our neighbors are doing as opposed to, what makes the most sense or, from a financial standpoint. So there's all these different biases in our decision making. So I'm really interested in exploring those. And then also what I'm really interested in is trying to understand how much people are making decisions based on their observations and direct experiences of environmental change versus information they get from their peers or experts or, basically their social networks, which can include the social media. So how much of it is based on their experience versus social influence.
And are you including in all of this, to what degree people make their decisions based on what a governing body or some higher body tells them to do?
Some of that goes into this construct that I'm interested in called response appraisal. That's basically do I believe that there are things that can be done to reduce this risk or the damages from this hazard? And can I do those things? Even if there are things that can be done, can I do those things? Do I have the physical ability, the knowledge and skills, the financial, resources? So that kind of construct gets at kind of some of those higher level kind of issues like, okay, is it permitted? Is it required? Is it incentivized? Is it socially condoned? That's not something that really individuals can control, but it influences individual decision making.
Yeah, the concept of response appraisal seems really interesting. Do you have any kind of examples of where this fight between social influence and reasonable or sort of practical action plays out in your work?
Yeah, I just actually got off of a phone call with my colleagues where we're trying to analyze data to explain the behavior of family forest owners. So these are people like family farmer owners. These are families who own forest land or ranches or just properties that are forested and therefore prone to wildfire risk in certain geographic areas. And so in this case, it's in the western Pacific Northwest, an area that historically rarely experienced wildfire because it's like where these temperate rainforests are. Old growth forest, the land of the spotted owl and the marbled murrelet and all these like very wet kind of forest species. And recently, there's been some really big fires, and there's been several like repeated fires in certain areas. And so in this area, people who don't really have very much experience with fire are starting to face fire as a hazard. So we're trying to understand kind of what influences their perception, ultimately their behavior. But in order to understand their behavior, we're trying to understand what influences their perceptions of risk. So like the probability that a fire will happen and how bad it could be if it happens, and also their perceptions of their ability to reduce risk. And their ability to reduce risk, that's a really important variable in this particular context because people don't have experience managing wildfire in this area. There's actually not even a lot of knowledge about how it should be managed. There's not like programs to help them manage it. So that factor of response appraisal, like can something be done and can I do that thing, that is actually just as much of an influence on their behavior as their perceptions of risk. So we're really interested in that relationship. Like, people can be really worried about something, but if they don't feel like they can do anything about it, then they may not make an effort.
That's really interesting that you kind of have to understand both their perceptions of their capability in fighting the hazard, as well as their perceptions of the hazard's risk. Is the hope that your research, like this project in the Pacific Northwest, is the hope that it will eventually contribute to initiatives or programs that do help empower people to envision themselves as part of the solution?
Depends on the context. Like in the Western Pacific Northwest, there's not really a consensus about how people should be managing their forest land or even their residential properties to reduce the chance of a fire breaking out and to reduce the damage that would result from a fire. I think, a lot of it's probably a lot like what's, what we learned with the LA fires, that people pretty much need to be ready to evacuate and to respond to these extreme events. Like in many ways, it may be hard to prevent them from happening, but people can be prepared to to evacuate or prevent losses from them by more of like preparedness, and but also that there might be things that people can do in terms of like fuel breaks or for homeowners, residents, like making sure that your home or the house you live in, the residence you live in, is home hardened, so like built out of fire resistant material. So that's one thing. And then with forest owners, there might be ways you can create large fuel breaks or thin your forest to prevent fire from burning as much vegetation, to prevent fire from getting so intense because it has less vegetation to burn. But we don't know a lot, I don't think, about like how fires actually behave in those environments just because they haven't really been the focus of study. So yes, ultimately our research wants to help inform policy and programmatic efforts that would give people the tools to do something about it. But in some areas that are experiencing large fires, there's just, because there isn't a big history of them in like our lifetimes, there's not a lot known about what can be done.
Interesting. So is that research into fire behavior and beyond, is that research happening at all anywhere? And, going off of that, something else I wanted to ask anyway, are there generally resources and funding avenues for this type of work? Are people recognizing the need for informed solutions?
These areas that are not historically fire prone, at least not like they didn't have frequent fires. There is research starting. It's pretty recent because that was a real wake up call. These 2020 fires, they're also called the Labor Day fires, that affected Western Oregon and a little bit in Western Washington. So that really, was a wake up call. And so has been some research mainly funded by the Forest Service to better understand, okay, well, what is the history of fire? What kinds of fires have burned in this area? Like what's the future likelihood of fires with climate change? And, the fact that we have all these people living and doing things that sometimes can cause fires in those areas. And as you probably heard, this fall, right, there were all these fires on the East Coast, right? So people over there, so historically there was fire in those systems, and Native Americans used fire, but in recent history, like in our lifetimes or in the last few generations, there hasn't been very much fire. So like people there don't really know that much about what to do to prepare for and prevent losses from fire. On the east side of the Cascade Mountains, that's an area where historically fires burned relatively frequently, like every 10 to 30 years. And because there isn't a lot of vegetation, because it's dry, and because fires historically happen so often, there's not a lot of vegetation to burn, so the fires don't get so bad. So people, in that kind of environmental context, they have a lot more experience, and there's a lot of information about how people can manage their forest lands and their residential properties to prevent fires from breaking out and to prevent damage from fires. So part of the Pacific Northwest has a lot of knowledge and experience managing fire, but it's that western kind of historically like temperate rainforesty wet areas where it's like a new kind of event, an extreme event.
Well, moving on, I wanted to ask you about the Western Forest and Fire Initiative. Could you tell me a little bit about it and explain its broader sort of practical implications for fire management?
Yeah, so the Western Forest and Fire Initiative is an initiative at University of Michigan to kind of, on the one hand, like build capacity at Michigan for doing work on the wildfire crisis. Since, we're a really strong research institution, we value interdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary research, so research that is not just across, academic disciplines, but also engages with practitioners, so like the work can have impact. So we're an institution that really values all of that, but there hasn't been a lot of work here on wildfire. And so the Western Forest and Fire Initiative was to support, one of the initial focus was to support startup or pilot work by an interdisciplinary group of faculty on fire. So like there was somebody from engineering, the CLASP, Climate and Space Sciences, somebody from nursing, people here at SEAS, energy engineer, somebody focusing more on Indigenous Native American studies, and me, human behavior. So basically it funded or supported 5 faculty from across different disciplines to start doing work on wildfire. And then beyond that kind of like, startup initiative, it was also aimed at trying to develop a new understanding of the Western wildfire crisis by taking this kind of interdisciplinary systems lens, where we were looking at how all these different kind of systems were interacting. So like our power system interacting with like our forest management system and climate change in general, along with like kind of our fire management system, and like how kind of these systems all work together to kind of reinforce and perpetuate a problem. And so we were taking a systems approach, and it takes, only really an interdisciplinary group can do that. Also a group of people who, have looked at issues in other contexts, outside the wildfire or the forest context, and bringing that, like looking at the wildfire challenge through the lens of having looked at other systems. So that all allowed us to kind of take a larger systems approach. So those were kind of like the three things, like starting up research on fire at University of Michigan, forming an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary team, and then taking a systems approach to looking at the problem.
Okay, that makes sense. And how are you going beyond just the research faculty to work with those practitioners, and what types of practitioners is your team working with?
Well, so for the startup phase, we had a professor of practice, so somebody who works both with academics and practitioners. So we had that person as part of our team. And she helped for every one of our pilot projects. She helped facilitate a process through which we first consulted with practitioner organizations about like what kinds of information needs they had. And then we tried to design the project so they address those information needs. And then we tried to have outputs from the projects that actually, provided some sort of benefit, like, basically met those information needs. So not just academic papers or, journal articles, which is typically what academics produce. So that's part of it, is like our research process engaged practitioners at different stages throughout the research process, and it yielded, some sort of output of benefit.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'd love to now turn to discussing the intersection of your work and the LA fires. So what do you think the LA fires tell us about our ability to adapt to increased risk of large wildfires, both at an individual and collective levels?
I mean, it's really hard for individuals to adapt on their own because, it's hard for people to afford to make the changes that they need in order to be prepared for large wildfires. I don't want to, diminish like how challenging that is for individuals. I mean, I think in the case of the LA fires, it's yet another example of like how regular citizens are not prepared for, natural disasters that in many ways are completely predictable. Now, individual households shouldn't be in charge of anticipating them, but all of our elected officials and our planners and our, disaster management people, that was a very predictable event. I mean, not only do we know that those kinds of fires happen periodically, but also with a huge, a really heavy precipitation season after a lot of drought, you're going to have a whole bunch of vegetation growth. So everybody knew we had, there was relatively abundant vegetation, more vegetation that's typical in that area. And then, the rainy season came late, so it was all dried out. And then, the winds, I don't really know the details about why the winds were so strong, but there are some climate explanations for why the winds were so strong. But you put those three things together and that creates the condition for catastrophic fires. So that kind of information is readily available to our emergency response and disaster planning kind of professionals. So what does it say about individual and kind of institutional ability to adapt to wildfire risk? Well, it doesn't it doesn't make things look very promising, right? Because, it should have been predictable for, like, at the institutional level, right? Like, we should have known that was going to happen, and then people should have, communities and institutions in our community should have taken measures to protect our residents. But yeah, at the individual level, it's interesting because, there's definitely already a momentum around rebuilding, and there's not necessarily a clear indication that the rebuilding is going to happen in a dramatically different way. Like, we don't really know what it's going to look like, but just from reading the news, there's not like a lot of indication that LA is going to rebuild with fire, climate adapted land use planning, zoning, structure, building codes or anything. So, I do wonder, like, it does seem like, if anything, if we could have any kind of wake up call, right? Like, that would be one. Like, that's pretty catastrophic what happened. But I do think, like, in general, like, our society is becoming more aware that fire is in our future, and fire is in the future in places that don't have a long history of fire. Like, it's a novel kind of hazard that we're now, people are going to be facing. So I think there's more awareness. There's more concern about smoke, but it is so costly in terms of energy, time, money to actually create fire adapted communities. So I'm sure there'll be some effort, but the jury's out, like, whether it'll be sufficient, I think, in LA.
Yeah, I do doubt that I'll be able to live in LA in the future, which is sad, because I grew up there and would love to have a family out there and be near my own family. I mean, do you think there was anything emergency response and city personnel could have done differently in the immediate moment?
I mean, I guess they could have evacuated people,
Earlier.
like kind of like we do with hurricanes,
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of emphasis on evacuation beforehand.
Yeah.
Now, it's hugely disruptive, and, we can't really predict fire like we can landfall.
Yeah.
So it would have to be, like, I don't know, are the immediate costs or the immediate burden of, like, getting people out of harm's way worth it? I mean, I guess that's, like, for a community to decide, but I mean, that's something that could be done, I guess, is to actually, recognize that this is extreme. I mean, it was recognized as extreme fire weather,
Right.
but people were still going out and about and doing things in kind of wildland areas, and people were going about their normal business. So, there could be, like, more extreme measures taken during extreme fire weather to get people, first of all, out of that hazard zone, also to prevent people from starting fires accidentally, because whether who knows how it started, but like, whether it's intentional or accidental, fires do ignite, right? Like, we have all sorts of sources of ignitions in our infrastructure, and just as a result of all the different things that we do, so it's kind of hard to stop prevent any spark from happening. But we could have maybe done more that way. And then in terms of, like, preventing the fire from being as damaging, there's people could be building with fire resistant materials. They could be having less vegetation.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to live like that? I mean, part of the reason people like LA is because there's a lot of natural features, and the vegetation is really beautiful.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just really hard.
Right. And at least in the case of LA, it's not just the immediate surrounding areas that should be worried about fire, right? I mean, 2023 in Michigan, we saw some pretty insane smoke activity because of all the fires all the way over in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, smoke moves around. So whether we'll have more smoke events like Michigan experienced in 2023, I think there's a lot of reason to expect that we will, because projections are that we're going to have more wildfires in places like, Canada and across like the boreal and temperate forests in Canada, and definitely in the temperate forests in the western United States. And that's a lot of vegetation to burn. So we're going to have more smoke, and that smoke goes somewhere. It follows these, air currents. So, I think that we're going to have more smoke events in the upper Midwest and the East. Definitely more smoke. I mean, there are like models projecting like we're going to have a lot more smoke events in the Pacific Northwest compared to historically. We're already having more smoke events in California, and smoke is a killer. It's like heat, it's like, okay, you don't necessarily see the mortality like immediately, but it can be calculated in terms of like excess deaths and, complications of other diseases. So it can be calculated. It's just that we don't really see it in terms of like at the same time that the fires are and the smoke events are happening. Yeah, well, and especially in LA, because that's not just wood smoke, right? Yeah. That's like toxic materials burning. I think it must be way worse. But the wood smoke alone is really bad, in part because the particles are so small that, they can go directly into your bloodstream. They can go directly like from your nose into your brain, is what like some of the recent research is showing. And then, that's not even counting for all the toxic stuff that's burning.
That was Dr. Paige Fischer at the University of Michigan, giving us some important insight into human behavior in the face of fire disaster. Along with some resources for LA fire victims, you can check out links to her research, including the Western Forest and Fire Initiative, in this episode's notes. I'm Mary Crockett. Thanks for listening.